Welcome to the first characteristic of a good tax, sufficiency. As any good politician would tell you, taxes need to be sufficient to keep the government operating. If a government is unable to support itself, its collapse is imminent. Since governments are self-perpetuating, this generally only happens when things are going terribly wrong for the government. For example, a coup. Recall that revenues are really for the most part taxes, and taxes equals rate times base. Also note that governments are nonprofit entities. If a government collects too much revenue, it should return that revenue to the taxpayers. If a government has too little revenue, then it has a few options. Increasing taxes generally means either increasing the rate or increasing the base, or both. The general consensus among economists is that the most neutral tax, which is the one that affects the distribution of capital the least, is the one that has a broad base and low rates. For example, it is considered better to tax all of the income at a lower rate than maybe only capital gains at a very high rate. You can see where capital would flow away from capital investment opportunities and into other income generation if that were the case. However, due to political pressure, governments often find themselves in a position where revenues are less than spending. One option is to use accounting trickery, and I assure you that governments are not shy about trying such maneuvers. California employees like myself are paid once a month, typically on the last day of the month. One year, to accomplish a bit of budget trickery, the final paycheck of the state's fiscal year was moved to the first day of the following year. Anyone who paid attention during your fundamental financial accounting course should know that that is an entirely bogus move, since the services were provided and the liability incurred. But from a budget perspective, it worked because the accounting system does not work under normal GAAP rules. However, tricks like that only work in the short run, and for smaller amounts. Instead, what governments often do when revenues are less than spending is borrow. And the U.S. government is no stranger to this activity. Economists generally measure a country's debt by comparing it to the country's gross domestic product. This is not dissimilar to the way a bank examines an individual's income before loaning money for a car or house. This chart shows U.S. borrowing from about 1970 on. You should note that borrowing was also very high during World War II. You can see that since about 1980, we've been on a bit of a bender with the financial crisis of the late 2000s, putting us into much higher than normal amounts of debt. My personal opinion is that we're a bit like someone that has maxed out their credit cards and then lost their job and then really had to borrow. So how much debt is too much? That is a difficult question to answer. The Economist magazine keeps track of country-by-country debt, and I presented Current Snapshot for you with details from our two neighbors, Canada and Mexico, on the right-hand side. You can see we have a great deal more debt per capita than Mexico, but not a lot more than Canada. Now, does that mean Mexico is on track and we are way too high? Not necessarily. If we agree that interest rates are a reflection of the time value of money and the risk of non-payment, then the U.S. seems to be enjoying some of the lowest debt costs ever. It would appear that even at these amounts, the world seems to think the full faith and credit of the U.S. is still a pretty darn good bet. So, how does the debt discussion relate to taxes, you ask? Well, government borrowing is simply borrowing against future tax revenue. Government debt is more like a credit card loan than a house. There's no property to foreclose on if the government fails to pay. Instead, the creditors are banking on the government's ability to raise the necessary revenue to pay them back, plus interest. As a result, countries with greater earning potential tend to be better able to borrow. If we go back a slide, you can see that the economies of the sub-Saharan Africa are not able to support much borrowing. That's a little bit like real life. When you really need the money, it seems that's when it's most difficult to come by anyone that will loan it to you. One of the problems with the U.S. government's continued spending habits is that you, as mostly younger folks, need to recognize that we, as older folks, are writing checks that you will be asked to cover through your taxes. Eventually, we'll have to cover that debt. And when we do, as an older citizen, I just want to say in advance, thank you. Okay, we're going to shift gears a bit. And I want to talk to you about a shopping mall in a small town on the southern border of New Hampshire. New Hampshire is the live free or die state. And among its unique characteristics is it has no sales tax. It also has an income tax only on interest and dividends, and although not part of this discussion, is indicative of the live free or die attitude. Anyway, originally the mall was to straddle the border, with retail on the New Hampshire side, and restaurants were going to be on the Massachusetts side, since Mass has a lower meals tax. However, the government of Massachusetts declared all customers in all stores would have to pay sales tax to Massachusetts. Therefore, the mall was redesigned so that all the stores and restaurants were on the New Hampshire side of the border. When they redesigned the mall to put the parking in Massachusetts with all the retail in New Hampshire, they actually made a small measurement error. If you look really closely, you can see where they nipped the corner off JCPenney to ensure that no retail at all was in Massachusetts. So the town on the Massachusetts side of the border is Tyngsboro, Massachusetts. Of course, I'd like it to be Bikini Bottom to fit into this module, but I digress. So let's imagine that Tyngsboro has a shortfall in its city budget, and it does not wish to kick the can down the road through borrowing. So instead, the city council decides to raise the sales tax rate by 1%, which is the exact amount needed to close the budget based on the expected retail sales. But what did our earlier examples about the hotels in Florida teach us? Consumers are going to vote with their feet. There's a pretty good chance that with such a good substitute for shopping nearby, that retail sales in Tyngsboro might decrease as a result of the tax increase. If so, should Tyngsboro have increased the sales tax by more than 1% to cover the lost revenue? When we think about forecasting tax revenues, there are two bookend models to consider. Static, which means we do not forecast any change in taxpayer behavior as a result of a change in tax rates. But the generally preferred model is a dynamic model that does consider changes in taxpayer behavior. However, estimating taxpayer behavior, especially in the aggregate, can be tricky. This chart shows the difference in GDP growth estimates based on a static forecast of the recent tax cuts and a dynamic forecast of the same. Like so many other questions in life, whether tax cuts spur economic growth or whether tax increases slow growth, well, the answer is almost always, it depends. The theoretical underpinnings are there. Tax cuts should spur growth, but it is the amount of growth that is so difficult to predict. When researchers cannot find big data to investigate, we often turn to individual subjects and attempt to see behavior at the micro level. So SpongeBob is a celebrity chef, and he makes $5 million a year. His marginal tax rate is 40%. If the rate increases to 41%, will SpongeBob not want to take any risk or expend any resources in order to keep at most 59 cents on the dollar he earns? Let's look at Patrick, who only makes $25,000 a year. Now, of course, I'm not sure really what Patrick does, but that's neither here nor there. His marginal tax rate is 10%. If the rate increases to 15%, Patrick may really need the additional 80 cents per dollar, 85 cents per dollar, and thus work extra for the income. SpongeBob's need for the additional money is likely to be lower than Patrick's, who is living paycheck to paycheck. In Patrick's situation, a tax increase is likely to mean he will need to find additional work to cover the now shortfall in his after-tax cash flow. As for SpongeBob, he may decide the risk of investing no longer warrants the investment and simply sit on his money. What is certain is that from the government's perspective, when it comes to raising revenue, it takes a whole lot of Patricks to equal one SpongeBob. We describe Patrick's situation as the income effect. Because Patrick needs the after-tax income to live, he will need to find a way to replace that after-tax cash flow by working more or changing jobs or getting more hours. SpongeBob, on the other hand, may simply decide the investment isn't worth it. I'm going to Goo Lagoon. We call this the substitution effect because SpongeBob may substitute leisure for productive working time.
Learn it, know it, live it.
This really is simply a review of the marginal utility of income. And frankly, SpongeBob is just much further down the curve than Patrick. So if Squidward earns $100,000 in income and pays taxes of $20,000 or 20%, and the tax rate is expected to increase from 20% to 25%. If the income effect describes Squidward, what will his pre-tax income need to be in order to keep his after-tax earnings the same? Well, to solve this, we really just need to do a little bit of algebra. So we know that after-tax equals pre-tax times 1 minus the tax rate. Well, in this situation, now we have after-tax. What we don't have is pre-tax. But we sure can solve for that and discover that pre-tax is $106,667. And you can go ahead and work forward and test the math if you want to. Okay, now we're going to turn to Mr. Krabs. And Mr. Krabs is sitting on a pile of uninvested cash. In fact, it's $500 million. Krabs is currently invested at the risk-free rate. That is the rate of return that matches inflation. There's no additional return for any risk being assumed by Krabs. However, Krabs has decided he's seeking a higher return and knows that to achieve that higher return, he will almost certainly have to take on some risk. But at least he knows he will be accommodated for doing so with a higher return. Taxes serve as a drag on that return because we know that pre-tax minus tax equals after-tax. So for any positive tax, after-tax returns are lower. So at what tax rate will Krabs decide the risky investment is no longer worth it? At a 0% tax rate, since taxes wouldn't matter, they'd have no effect. At a 100% tax rate, Krabs wouldn't keep anything, so he's extremely unlikely to invest. At an 80% tax rate, which existed, by the way, prior to 1986, Krabs keeps only a small amount of return. In fact, so little that he might deem the investment worthless. At a 50% tax rate, Krabs keeps half and the government takes half. And somehow that just doesn't feel fair. Research shows that tax rates somewhere around the 40 to 50% mark is where people start to get uncomfortable with their after-tax return and won't make the investment. Now, does that mean the tax rate should be 40 or 49%? Well, that's really hard to say. Because the U.S. economy runs on risky investments, we must have a system that encourages risky investment, and that means after-tax cash flows. As mentioned previously, presidential tax plans have not had the effects on economic growth that are often anticipated, especially by that administration. The current fiscal policy being espoused by the Fed seems to have a much greater effect, and tax plans should be put lower on the hierarchy and maybe more time spent on government spending plans. What better way to close this video than a heartfelt thanks for paying my salary, my health care, and retirement through your current and future taxes. Did I already say thank you? I won't even raise the specter of the possible externalities, such as climate change, that my generation seems happy to leave to yours. This is the end of video 1G on sufficiency. Our next video continues the discussion of good taxes by looking at fairness. Let the politics begin. Thanks for watching.